Welcome to Sobol Says for Parshas Mishpatim. We will do a brief overview of the Parsha this week. Obviously, this Parsha contains more mitzvos than your average one, to say the least. I believe it's 53 mitzvos in this week's Parsha that are given. That weighs in at almost 10% of all the mitzvos in the Torah. So there's a lot to discuss, sometimes too much to discuss. It reminds me of some of those restaurants whose menu is so huge. They have like 500 things on the menu that very often I end up just choosing the same dish each time. It's too intimidating, all those different choices. Similarly, with a Parsha like this, it has so many varied topics in it, and yet very often we end up focusing on the same few because of that very phenomenon. But nonetheless, they are primarily dealing with civil laws, interpersonal laws, business laws, things of that nature, and all of the Mefarshim, first and foremost Rashi among them, point out the fact that the Parsha starts, Ve'ele HaMishpatim, and these are the Mishpatim, the ordinances as they call it, the laws, and the reason why it begins with a Vav Achibor, to connect to the prior Parsha, is simply because, of course, last week's Parsha we discussed, or it contained the Aseres HaDibros, and it is telling, the Torah is telling us that just as the Aseres HaDibros were given at Har Sinai, so too were all of these mitzvos given at Har Sinai, and they are equally important. And of course, that is because Judaism is not merely a ritualistic religion. Rather, everything we do in every aspect of our lives should be and is guided by the Torah. And this is a stark reminder of that by juxtaposing it to the Aseres HaDibros. And frankly, we are rarely, if ever, called out by the Goyim for not practicing our religion properly when it comes to ritual. You know, you will never hear the non-Jews protesting over our standard of kashrus or whether our mikvah is up to the proper standards. But of course, we are called out big time when we mess up in civil laws, embezzlement, or things of that nature. We all play the newspaper game, when you see a big scandal and you immediately scan the article to see if any of the last names are Jewish, Rahman al-Islam. And of course we do that not only because we have prurient natures, but also because we are very fearful of the ensuing Chil Hashem, of it in some way justifying, if it possibly could, any stereotypes that might be that might adhere to our religion, and therefore the civil laws, the business laws, the Torah is reminding us right now, are equal to the Ten Commandments. They are all equally important and all must be observed accordingly. And it's truly a Chil Hashem when we have our brethren publicly caught, frankly, for some sort of corruption. I guess as you get older, this may or may not be a phenomenon, I don't know. I unfortunately seem to be experiencing this, where I've known in the past few years, I personally know a number of people that have appeared on the front pages of major newspaper publications, and I assure you it was not for good things that they appeared over there. And it's very sad, and it is hurtful, and the truth is, it's not even that we have any kind of disproportionate representation in that area. It's just that much more what we call nikar, recognizable when it is a Jew, and even more so when it's an Orthodox Jew that it happens with. But the Chil Hashem is not because they broke the civil laws of America or the criminal laws of America. That's not the Chilul Hashem. Yes, it's a Chilul Hashem when a Jew is caught doing something improper. But the Chilul Hashem is because they violated the Torah. That's the Chilul Hashem. See, we don't like to think of it like that, right? We don't like to think that when we violate the Torah, and certainly if it's public, that it's a Chilul Hashem, right? It's bad enough we have to reconcile that we've done something wrong. We don't like to think of it like that. So we are able to somehow compartmentalize that it's okay, provided it's not also breaking criminal laws of the country in which we reside, because then they're going to catch us and then we're going to be in the newspaper. That's also a Chilul Hashem, no question about it. But the Chilul Hashem is that they broke the laws of the Torah. Not one of those people who got nailed for any of those crimes were adhering to the Torah. I promise you that. Their crimes were violations of the Torah also. And I am not talking about the warm and fuzzy Dina de Malchusa Dina, that the laws of the land are the laws. I'm not even going there. I'm talking about every crime they committed was a direct violation of the Torah. And that is the Chilul Hashem. Whenever we break the Torah, of course, that is a desecration of God's name. And that is specifically why the Torah juxtaposes these laws to the Sinai experience. To remind us, to anticipate our rationalizations, and thus remind us that these are God-given just like the others. Which may very well explain why, of all the laws delineated, the Parsha begins with the laws of the Eved Ivri, which if we have time today, we will go over a little bit later on. If not, then you have something to look forward to for next year. But just simply, the Oznaim LaTorah asks one very fundamental question, and that is, why was it necessary to start off with the laws of Eved Ivri, especially when it would seem that that's a very sore subject for a people that had the fresh, bitter taste of slavery in their mouths. I mean, we're talking 7 weeks from Egypt to Sinai, and then this is happening immediately thereafter, and it would seem like proper treatment of a slave would not be an area that we would need to be schooled on at that time. Obviously, having just gone through it should make us very sensitive to those issues. And as we know, the Gemara tells us, Kona Eved, Kona Baal, that when you acquire a slave, you acquire a master. And that's simply because the laws of Eved Ivri are so onerous on the owner, no pun intended, requiring him to treat the Eved with such respect. As we know, he must give him the same quantity of food as he eats. He must give him the same quality of food and all other conditions. And famously, we know if he has only one pillow, he must give it to the Eved over himself. And that is precisely why the Gemara tells us that maxim, that when you acquire a slave, you acquire a master. But one could argue, as we said, that who would be more sensitive to a slave's needs than a people that had just gone through slavery? So why start off with this? So the Znaim LaTorah answer is very interesting. He gives us a very interesting psychological insight. He said, in fact, just the opposite occurs. Herod, Stalin, and many others that rose to power from the common or slave ranks ended up being the most vicious of all to the very people that they came from. It is human tendency to go in the opposite direction once we are cured of those social ills. Once we have spurned that lifestyle, very often we turn cruel towards it. Therefore, the Torah wanted to immediately combat the possibility of such a mindset setting in, which may very well be why throughout the Torah even we are continually reminded of the fact that we were slaves in Egypt. Not to humiliate us, perhaps not even always to demand great gratitude from us, but simply to prevent that phenomenon from occurring. If we have time, we'll return to the Eved Ivri. Then we are taught the laws of Jewish maidservant, manslaughter, murder, injuring a parent, kidnapping, cursing a parent, killing of slaves, personal damages, and then comes a very famous or perhaps infamous Pasuk, ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein, that an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. That is something that is oft quoted. We are going to return to that to focus on it in a little while. Then you have injury to slaves. And if you injure your slave's eye or tooth, if you knock out his eye or his tooth, the slave goes free, but that is only speaking of an Eved Kanani, not speaking of an Eved Ivri. Only a non-Jewish slave goes free if you knocked out his eye or his tooth. A Jewish slave does not go free. The reason why, very briefly, is because, as the Me'am Loez tells us, for an Eved Ivri, the idea is it's not a punitive status. An Eved Ivri is somebody who is trying to be rehabilitated, and that is occurring if he had stolen money and he cannot pay it back. That is the classic case of the Eved Ivri. He's given the opportunity to make restitution by not the victim himself necessarily, but he is sold, and with that money, his victim is paid back. And in the meantime, he now has an honest living that he can make for 6 years. His family is taken care of during that process. And the whole purpose of Eved Ivri is one of chesed. It is a kindness. It is not a punishment and is not a deterrent, but rather it is there simply to try to rehabilitate this guy back into society. The Eved Kanani, by contrast, why did he become an Eved Kanani? Why are Kananim the slaves? So we know, of course, when Noah, after the flood, gets drunk and he debases himself, his son Ham, actually it's his grandson Canaan, who goes and runs to tell his father Ham about what's happening with his father. And sure enough, Ham comes, and regardless of what medrash you're reading, whether they castrated Noah, whether they sodomized Noah, they took great glee in his embarrassing state of drunkenness and took advantage of him. Thereafter, Noah curses Canaan and says that he will be a slave to his brothers. Canaan, hence it's called an Eved Kanani. The Me'am Loez tells us that the reason why a Kanani slave goes free, if his eye or his tooth is knocked out, is because, why is he a slave in the first place? Because his eye saw something. Canaan saw his grandfather in his drunken state and should have turned away his eyes, and certainly should not have gone to tell his father about it. And believe me, he wasn't doing it so his father could take better care of Noah, but rather he was doing it to report it. The eye and the mouth sinned, and therefore the Eved Kanani is an Eved because of the eye and the mouth. But if that should be injured during his stint as an Eved, then he has received his just punishment. He has received a tikkun, a fixing of the very problem that created his status in the first place, and therefore he is allowed to go free. By contrast, an Eved Ivri is not there because he did something wrong with his eyes or his mouth. He is there for a different purpose, and as I said, it's not punitive, but rather rehabilitative. And therefore, him getting injured does not have anything to do with his status as an Eved. Then we learn about a killer ox, damages, pits and goring, penalties for stealing, damages, grazing, fire, shomer chinam, shomer sachar, borrowed items. Then on page 430, just take a quick peek if you'd like. On page 430, Pasuk 17. One of my favorites. Machashefa lo sechayeh. You shall not permit a sorceress, a witch, to live. Okay, seems like a halacha that doesn't have much practical value these days. But I point it out because every year or few years, I always at this Parsha must recount this short story because boy is it powerful. There's a lot to learn from it. This pasuk not only teaches us that a witch shall not live, but rather it also teaches us that you have to be careful how you talk, even in the privacy of your own home. And I tell you that because I once heard a story many years ago from Rabbi Schiffman. He was the principal of the Hebrew Academy of Miami at the time, and he told me that he used to like to go check on the classrooms throughout the day or whatever, and very often he'd come into a classroom and ask them about the Parsha of the week, or go over it with them. And one time he went into a 3rd or 4th grade class, and it was on Parshas Mishpatim, and he went over this pasuk, and he said the pasuk says, Machashefa lo sechaya, that a machashefa should not be allowed to live. And he said to the class, does anyone know what a machashefa is? Silence, nothing. A few seconds later, does nobody know what a machashefa is? Finally, one little girl raises her hand. She goes, does that mean mother-in-law? And so you have to be very, very careful, because obviously that was the way her father or her mother often used to refer to their mother-in-law, and therefore you have to be very careful, because often our children learn a lot more inside the home than they do inside of their school, and therefore that is a warning to watch how you speak. Then comes the kindness to widows and orphans that we must do. I will also tell you that both of my parents and my brother passed away within a 8-year period. It was a lot of shivas in a short amount of time. So already by the 3rd shiva, you start to get a certain macabre sense of humor, a darker humor in being able to talk about certain things which drove my children crazy. And very often, I remember that year or two after my mother had passed away, whenever things would get rough, or whenever my kids would be giving me a hard time, I'd be like, what are you doing? I'm an orphan. How can you treat me like this? And they did not find that funny at all. The point is, though, of course, I am an orphan. Anybody who is without parents is an orphan. However, halachically, that is not the case, just so you know. The actual definition from halacha, obviously, it could, for starters, just be the father that's dead. But either way, it's only until 18 or 21, that's when you're considered an orphan. After that, you're on your own. But just thought I would share that with you. Then we have idolatry, lending money. We're going to come back to that as well. Strayed and fallen animals. Then we come to the laws of Shemitah and Shabbos. You can note in those psukim that they are all 6 and then 7. It says for Shemitah, 6 years you'll sow the land, and on the 7th you'll rest. By Shabbos as well, it says 6 days you will work, and on the 7th you will rest. Which reminds me also, last week's Parsha, there's the Medrash about how the Torah had been offered to all the different nations of the world, and they each found something in it that was unappealing to them, and they rejected the Torah until the Jews accepted it. They tell a further story about that, not a Medrash, that they had offered it to the Jews even, and the Reform Jews said they didn't want it because it says you're not allowed to eat pork, and then the conservative Jews didn't want it because you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbos, and they wanted to drive, and then it came to the Orthodox, the Haredim, and they asked them if they wanted it, and they rejected it too also, and they said, why? He said, because of Shabbos. They said, really? You guys don't keep Shabbos? They said, no, it's because it says first you have to do 6 days of work. Anyway, then we have the Shalosh Regalim, and then finally the laws of combining milk and meat or cooking them together. Then we're warned about the being influenced by the 7 nations and not to make peace with them. Then finally comes the famous Naaseh V'Nishma and the instructions for Moshe, whereby he's going to ascend the mountain, stay for 40 days and nights to receive the Torah. And there is, just so you know, a major disagreement amongst the poskim, amongst the commentators, as to when exactly that event occurred, whether it was before we received the Aseret Adibros or afterwards. Now let's come back to the beginning of the Parsha, and we're going to discuss 2 concepts and maybe a third if we have time. The 2 that we will discuss first are the pasuk I referenced before, ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye, And the second is lending money to your fellow Jew without interest. So I thought we would begin our more in-depth analysis today on one of I think it's one of the most oft quoted and oft misunderstood psukim in the Torah. And that's not just by Jews, that's by non-Jews as well. The idea of ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. Everybody has thrown that out there at least once in their lifetime. Eye for an eye, yeah. It's almost never used in a good, pure context either. It's always whatever. Nonetheless, the irony about this pasuk is that it is clear, and I mean clear, from both the Gemara as well as the earliest commentators, that this pasuk is not to be taken literally. The Rambam states clearly that it is a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It is an oral tradition passed down from Moshe from Sinai, and I dare say everyone agrees. There is no machlokas among the poskim or meforshim as to whether we should really knock out the person's eye or whether we should just have them pay money. Yet that very concept of a cruel yet seemingly just punishment is often thrown around by seemingly misinformed people, right? Oh, that guy did that? Well, do this, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. It's always thrown out there. Now, in fact, historically, it was often suggested that the Chachamim, the rabbis, had to backtrack or apologize, so to speak, for this seemingly cruel concept by having made up this more benign explanation that the Torah really meant monetary compensation. No, and you can understand, you have to be very careful, by the way, in dialogue, and when you read articles and listen to other people's positions, you have to be very careful to understand. I'm not sure I have on the video, but many times in my class, I speak about being wary of people's agenda. Don't just take their words at face value. And I say that because while it might not seem so crazy to have people say, no, the Torah means an eye for an eye, putting aside the fact that they're going to get into trouble if they put that into practice. The problem with that is as follows. You have to be careful of sinister setups. And I mean by the following. I'm going to say, the Torah says eye for an eye, which means it is a barbaric, old, out of date tome that really has no longer any practical application, and therefore, I don't have to listen to any of it. You have to be very careful. Or, you have to be careful when they say, oh, it's not literal. Then nothing in the Torah is literal. When it tells me not to do X, Y, Z, they're just making it up as they go along, and whatever is expedient, and whatever the rabbis want us to do, they're manipulating us, blah, 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 blah. That is basically what comprises all the biblical criticisms, all the conservative and reform positions, as well as that of open orthodoxy, all of whom basically try to take those tacks in very subtle ways. You can find yourself having a legitimate discussion about one thing when you don't realize that's just a setup. That's a platform for something completely different. And therefore, it is important to analyze these things and to understand why or why not the Chachamim interpreted something in a particular way. And so if you hear people suggesting that it's our modern, more civilized laws and lifestyles that have now tempered the Torah so that it has left its barbaric stage, you should know the Chachamim forever ago already discussed this very issue. And in fact, as I had mentioned, the Gemara already discusses this very concept. But nonetheless, it was subject to still some naysaying. That is until the Vilna Gaon came along with the following gem that should dispel that notion once and for all. Because he, in fact, in that very pasuk, has a source for the position that when it says eye for an eye, it really is speaking about money. He said, look at the pasuk. It says ayin tachas ayin. Tachas, here being used as the word substitute. This instead of that, an eye for an eye. Tachas, however, also means below. It also is translated, as a matter of fact, its more common usage is to mean below. Based on that, he said we should read the pasuk as follows. Ayin, question mark, meaning what is the punishment for an ayin, for knocking out someone's eye? Tachas ayin, look under the eye. What does he mean by look under ayin, which ayin, by the way, is both a letter and the word for eye? So let's consider it. The aleph base, right? Aleph through taf. So if you had the word ayin spelled out, ayin yud nun, if you start the aleph base from the beginning, aleph base gimel dal hey vav zayin chet yud, chaf lamed mem nun samech ayin. The next letter underneath ayin is pei. Second letter in the word ayin, yud. The letter under the yud, chaf. Third letter in the word ayin, the nun. The letter under the letter under the nun is a samech. So you have pei, chaf, samech. Pei, chaf, samech. If you jumble that around, that spells kesef. Chaf, samech, pei. So the Vilna Gaon tells us, in order to understand what the compensation is for ayin, look under the ayin, and that spells kesef. In other words, that we must only give monetary restitution, or rather monetary punishment for someone knocking out someone's eye. Now, that's wow, right? You have to remember that Vilna Gaon did not live in the time of computers. He actually was a human computer. The fact that he could figure that out is mind-boggling. But nonetheless, that should definitely put the issue to rest. And yet, it still begs the question, why did the Torah pose it in that way? Why not just say, if you damage someone physically, you must pay damages? Much easier, less confusion. Why does the written Torah state such an ominous punishment and at the same time allow for the softer punishment according to the oral law? So we can answer that based on something I saw from a Rav Uri Cohen. He discusses that very issue, that very question. Why didn't the Torah just straight up say you pay money if you knock out someone's eye? Why does it have the easily misinterpreted, or maybe it's not misinterpreted, and certainly abused ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye? So he says the following idea. There are two types of approaches to answer this question. The first classic approach is that an eye for an eye would theoretically be justice for an attacker, a punishment which he deserves to receive. In other words, and he is, whether he knows it or not, taking a page out of the legal analyses for why we punish criminals, right? It's either punitive, retribution, or it's deterrence. Either we're doing it because the guy deserves to be punished, and therefore we are going to give him an appropriate punishment. Or do we do it to deter others from committing that same crime by seeing the punishment that one receives for doing it? So he wants to analyze this in the same way. So he says there's two approaches. The first is that it would be justice for an attacker. That is the punitive retribution type of approach. Or the second is that an eye for an eye serves as a deterrent for an attacker, which needs to stay on the books just in case. Now, the first approach, which acknowledges that the literal eye for an eye is correct, right? It's saying that is just, knocked out someone's eye, get your eye knocked out. But that, the oral law overrides it, is best explained by Rav Kook. Rav Kook was approached one time by a secular Zionist, and he asked Rav Kook about the halachic understanding of ayin tachas ayin, an eye for an eye. And he responded with an analogy based in part on Kabbalah. See, Kabbalah views the written Torah as a father and the oral law as a mother. That is an analogy, that's an imagery that they use very often. So based on that, Rav Kook said, when parents discover their son has committed a very grave offense, how do they react? The father immediately raises his hand to punish his son. At least maybe in Rav Kook's time. Nowadays you can't really do it anymore, but use either your imagination or your memory based on how old you are so you can understand that. But the mother, full of compassion, rushes to stop his raised arm. Please, not in anger, she pleads, and she convinces the father to mete out a lighter punishment. An onlooker might feel that all this drama and conflict is superfluous. In the end, the child did not receive corporal punishment. He didn't get that potch anyway, so why make a big show of it? In other words, listen, if the father's going to go through the motion, he's going to hit him, and the mother always runs to the rescue and says, please don't do it, my little tatala, and give him a timeout or something instead, then what's the whole point of the father raising his hand? Then let's just give him the punishment right away. In fact, the scene has great educational value for the errant son. Even though he was only lightly disciplined, the son was made to understand that his actions deserved a much more severe punishment. Okay, and that's a very powerful idea. The fact that he didn't get that punishment doesn't matter. There is a great impact. The fact that his father was going to strike him, that has a great impact, an educational impact on the child. This idea also holds true for one who injures another. Such an individual needs to realize the gravity of his actions. In practice, we can only make him pay monetary restitution, as the oral law, the mother, rules. But he should not think that money alone can rectify what he has done. It's a very beautiful analogy. So we understand already somewhat that the Torah is the father. The Torah has to raise its hand and tell you that is a horrific thing that you did. You knocked somebody's eye out. You deserve a smack in your face that's going to knock your eye out as well. But then the oral law comes and stops the father's raised hand. It says, okay, you made your point. Let's give him a lighter punishment though. And that's why the Chachamim instead are instructed merely to give monetary punishment for that. So in other words, the oral Torah tells the rabbis of a Beis Din that they should instruct an attacker to pay damages. The written Torah, in contrast, tells the attacker that he deserves much worse. The second approach, right, which we spoke of as a deterrent, can be best understood by a brief Gemara in Baba Kama. I'm just going to read you this Gemara. It is entertaining, no question. Rabbi Yitzchak Salad, who is my constant chavrusa, we learn virtually every day together. He used to say in our early years, I think he probably still says it to his Daf Yomi class, that there's a joke on every page in the Gemara. If you look closely enough, the Gemara always has some funny witticism, some tongue-in-cheek statement, whatever the case may be. If that's true what he says, then what I'm about to read you is definitely the joke on the page of this Gemara. And it is in Bava Kama, as I said, the fourth parak. Chanan bisha takale lahu gavra. Chanan the wicked delivered a blow to a certain person, popped him from the right side of the face. Also l'kamei to Rav Huna. So the case came before Rav Huna. Amar le, and Rav Huna said to Chanan the wicked, Zilhav le palga de zuzah. Okay, go give the victim a half zuz for his humiliation. Okay, so he had to pay compensatory damages. Actually, these don't sound compensatory in nature. It could be that the victim did not have actual damages, but nonetheless it was very humiliating for him that he would be clocked in public, and therefore Rav Huna ruled that Chanan has to pay him a half a zuz. Okay, no problem. What happens? Havale zuzamacha. Chanan happened to have a zuz on him, a whole zuz, not a half a zuz, but it was a worn-out coin. You see, nowadays we can't relate to that as much. In the olden days, so they had minted coins, but over time they were not created by a fancy mint like we have in the United States, but rather they were handmade, They would get worn out over time, and people didn't like to accept. There's a lot of Gemaras about this, the money changers, etc. They didn't like to accept those worn out zuzas because, you don't want to be the guy that's holding the bag on that one, right? You got it, and now nobody wants it from you. They say it's too rubbed out, they can't see it anymore. Excuse me, it's not like here where, even though you left that dollar bill in your jeans pocket when you washed it, and it's a little torn, and some moron wrote things on it, and things of that nature, they must accept your dollar. Your dollar is still legal tender. They must accept it. Not so in those days. If you had a worn out zuz, a lot of people didn't want that. So what happens? So Hanan the wicked is told to pay a half a zuz. He only has a whole zuz, but it's a worn out zuz. Lo have mishtikil lei. But nobody wanted to make change for him. Right? He said, listen, can anybody break this zuz? I need 2 half zuzes, I got to pay it. Nobody wanted to pay it. So what do you think Hanan did under those circumstances? Taka le acharina, v'yave na'ale. Sized up, pow! Clocked the guy a second time and then said, here's your zuz. And that's what happened. Ma'aseh shahaya kachaya. And that's what it did. Okay, so that's pretty funny actually that he took that tack. I quasi-respect that, to be honest, but the point is from that Gemara, we see something very interesting. It's a funny story, but it wouldn't be so funny if people started thinking like Hanan the wicked, right? Imagine what would happen. They would start going around and saying, now I know the price, 50 cents to clock a poor guy. I'm going to do that all day long. And as a matter of fact, he gets this idea from Rav Avram Yoel Abelson, who said the following idea. If the Holy Torah had written a sentence like, whoever blinds another person must pay money as a punishment, cruelty would have increased. Powerful, wealthy people would have blinded the poor with impunity, happily paying the damages from their deep pockets. After all, why would the rich care about paying the shekels instructed by a judge? And anyone who provoked the ire of such a powerful person would have ended up disabled. Yeah, in other words, guys would basically say, here, I have a $100 bill. Could you hold this for a second? To the poor guy, and he's like, oh, thank you. And then he's like, pow, pow, got his jollies out or whatever, can abuse anybody he wants. Okay, $100, what is that? That's nothing. It was worth it for me. The Holy Torah was concerned about this, so it presented a sentence that would apply across the board to both poor and rich. If someone blinds another person and the like, what he did will be done to him. Here the Torah made a fence to protect the poor from the powerful and tyrannical. In contrast, if it happens that one person blinds another when in a fight or an accident, Hashem gave Moshe the rule in the Holy Torah that the person should pay money. With this, the Torah fixed 2 things. The written Torah set up a fence against the corrupt and powerful, and the oral Torah made it unlikely that anyone will seek revenge. A Beis Din can instruct that money must be paid, assuming it is a place where there is no concern that the powerful will get out of hand. So before we move on, what he's basically saying here is, okay, the Torah needed to address 2 potential problems. One is the fact that if it just say, $20 to knock some guy's eye out, you're going to have a lot of rich, corrupt people doing whatever they want, abusing whomever they want, and I think we're in the thick of that now, #MeToo, or whatever they like to call that. That is also the same idea. You had very wealthy people doing whatever they wanted, however they wanted, with whomever they wanted, and then if they got caught, okay, so they paid settlement. That's how it works, and therefore the Torah wanted to prevent that. So the Torah tells you, you knock out someone's eye, we're knocking out your eye. But then it told the Chachamim, the oral law says, just make them pay money. Just make them pay money. But in the meantime, we have on the books that technically their eye should be knocked out. And the reason why that's important as well is because if there is a place, they say, where there is such a concern, and we might be heading there ourselves these days, then as a fence, the Torah law is that really what the Beis Din could apply. They really technically could apply an eye for an eye. The fact that they don't do it is something else. However, they have that in their pocket. And therefore, we come to the following case. This is another Gemara, also a short one, also with Rav Huna. And this Gemara is discussing what the punishment is if somebody raises their fist to another to strike them. Rav Huna said, Tikotzetz yado, his hand should be cut off. Now I know we're starting to sound like some of our Muslim neighbors in the Middle East, but technically that is the halacha. Shenemar uzro ramati shavir, for it stated, a raised arm shall be broken. Rav Huna kates yada. And in fact, Rav Huna carried out that punishment on somebody and cut off his hand. Now the background is that this was a guy who was a serial attacker. He was basically going around punching people right and left, maybe just right. And he was a major problem. And for that reason, Rav Huna took the extrajudicial maneuver of cutting off his hand. Not suggesting that we do that now. The point is, I think that Gemara is brought down to highlight the fact that that is created as a deterrent to prevent some maniac from constantly running around with impunity and just striking other people. In other words, it would be disastrous if people took advantage of the rule of monetary compensation, attacking others with little consequence. The oral law tells the rabbis of Beis Din that normally they should instruct an attacker to pay damages. The written Torah, in contrast, tells them that when necessary, they should put an eye for an eye into practice. So according to both approaches, the message of the Torah is that a combination of the written and the oral law are one. They cannot exist one without the other. And therefore the Torah needed to emphasize the appropriate physical punishment, but the oral law needed to give us the practical application. In other words, the Torah, it was not giving us some barbaric justice, eye for an eye message. It's telling us, you knock someone else's eye out, your eye deserves to be knocked out, plain and simple. But that's obviously not practical, and that's obviously not what we don't want. We don't want a nation of one-eyed people. Rather, from a practical perspective, we make you pay money, but we want you to appreciate the severity of your actions, so you not just think you can buy your way out of this, as we see the scourge that's occurring to this day. Nowadays, that's our problem. We don't want that, says the Torah. And therefore, we will make you pay money, but understand we should be knocking your eye out. Which brings us to the final topic I want to discuss, and that is the requirement to lend your brother money without interest. Recently, a friend of mine questioned the value of lending money, and he raised a legitimate point. He was concerned about people becoming indebted unnecessarily, and he challenged whether there was even a requirement or a benefit to doing that. And I showed him from this week's Parsha the source of it. And the story I'm going to share with you will be meaningful as well. So on page 430, at least we didn't have to flip around too much today, same page as before, Pasuk 24. It says, Im kesef tal ve'asami esa'ani imach lo siyer lo kenesha lo sisimun alav neshach. When, even though the word im, we're going to look at Rashi in a second, when you lend money to my people, to the poor who is with you, do not act towards him as a creditor. Do not lay interest upon him. Now the word im can mean if, or occasionally it can mean when. This is one of those times. As Rashi tells us, im kesef tal ve'asami, Rabbi Yishmael Omer, kol im ve'im shebetorah reshus chutz me'gimel. Every use of the word im in the Torah means it's optional. Right? It's permissible, im, meaning if, except for three places. V'zeh echad mehan. And this is one of those three places. This is one of the three places in the Torah, even though it says, im kesef talo, which we would think means if you lend money to your brother, but the Torah is telling us when you lend money to your brother, because in fact, one of the greatest kindnesses you could possibly do is to lend someone money. It allows them, of course, to take it in a dignified way and could assist them when they need just a little push, and that can be a powerful thing to do. So I wanted to end with a quick story. I normally don't like to tell stories like these, mostly because I don't think we really need them. If the Torah commands us to do something, then we should do it, not because of stories like this. But nonetheless, we could all use a boost once in a while, and this can give us great chizuk. It's a story I heard a number of years ago from Rabbi Frand, who said it in the name of Hanina Reisher, who knows the people that this happened to. So, as we said, the pasuk says in Kesef Talveh, when you lend your brother money, don't charge interest. So there were two very close friends in Far Rockaway. And one of them had fallen on hard times, and he was about to lose his business, and he needed a lot of money to keep his business afloat. So he goes to his very dear friend, and he asks him for a $250,000 loan. The friend, understandably, I don't want to make enemies, so I'm not going to say what neighborhood it might be close to Far Rockaway, where that might not be a big deal, but in Far Rockaway, that's a lot of money, and the friend says he doesn't have that kind of money to lend him. So the first guy says, you just told me a few weeks ago that you just finished paying off your mortgage. So could you please take out a new loan, a new mortgage on your house to lend me this money? I'm desperate. I'm going to lose my business. I'm going to lose everything if I don't get it. So the friend says, that's a huge ask, but I know it's a tremendous mitzvah, so let me go speak to my wife about it. And that's the first smart thing the guy did. Of course, always go speak to your wife about it. You can't go that wrong then. She says to him, even better advice, let's go ask our Rav. Let's see what he says. This is a serious undertaking. Let's see what he tells us to do. So the Rav says to him, you do not have to do this. Technically, even though it says im when, you don't have to issue the loan. But if you trust him and he is your friend, then it is a tremendous mitzvah, one that could have untold benefits for you. He says, okay. So he goes to the bank to take out a loan against the house, to take out a mortgage. And the bank says to him, you're in a floodplain. You're in a flood zone, and you need to get flood insurance for us to do the loan. And he said, I tell you something, I just finished paying off my mortgage. They never required me to take out flood insurance. And they said, maybe when you originally did it 30 years ago, it was not considered a flood zone. It is now. This is not something we can waive. It's a hard and fast rule. You need flood insurance in order to be able to get the mortgage. So, sure enough, he goes out, gets the flood insurance, then he takes the mortgage, gets the money, and lends it to his friends. 3 weeks later, in comes Hurricane Sandy and floods his entire house. And he was completely covered, saving him from a huge loss, something that would not have happened had he not made that loan. In short, he more than made up for the loan. And from that we learned that perhaps we cannot accept and our fellow man cannot pay interest on loans. But clearly Hashem has no such restrictions. Have a good Shabbos.